Hello YouTube. So, Freminent is here, and so far I've seen a lot of people automatically assuming that he must be weak, since he is a 4-star Claymore physical DPS. But is he actually weak, or are people jumping to conclusions way too fast? Well, I have taken the time to mathematically analyze him, so today we will be taking a deep dive into his numbers to see how he stacks up. But first, please be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I put a lot of time and effort into Theorycrafting, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. With that said, let's jump right into this. Alright, so per usual, this isn't a full guide, just a Theorycrafting mathematical analysis, so I won't go in depth explaining Freminet's kit. However, I will briefly summarize it, as his kit can be pretty confusing to read, but it's actually pretty simple. The easiest way to simplify Freminet's kit is that he is a physical Diluc. And by that, I mean that his playstyle is using his skill, weaving in a few normal attacks, using his skill, repeat. The skill gains stacks based on how many normal attacks you do, and what you want to get to, and you want to get to its level 4 stacks each time, because this will do pure physical damage, while the other levels will deal mostly cryo damage. The level 4 physical damage has pretty high scaling and gets a lot of buffs from Freminet's kit. You also want to make sure you're doing Freminet's combos within his burst, as it will reduce his skill cooldown all the way from 10 seconds to 3. It also make him gain 2 stacks per normal attack instead of 1. Freminent also gets different buffs throughout his kit through Frozen, Superconduct, and Shatter reactions, so you'll want to have Electro and Hydro on his teams ideally. The thing that I found most confusing to figure out with Freminent is his combo, but what I found seems to work best is EQ into PE, 2x into P in 1E. The P annotated in Freminet's combo stands for pair. This is him performing his level 4 skill, and then the skills annotated as E are him casting his skill to enter the pair timer state. With this combo, Freminent is going to in2 before each P, because 2 normal attacks get him to 4 stacks. When he is at 4 stacks, pressing normal attack again will cast a level 4 skill instead of doing a normal attack, so you can't actually go beyond in2 during his pair timer state and inside his burst. Then there was an in1 between the E's, because his skill is still on like half a second or so of cooldown at those intervals, so you'll fill that time with an in1. With this combo, his fill time seems to come out to about 12 to 13 seconds. You can also weave in another in1 after his initial E cast at the start before using his burst, as well as using one after his E at the very end, if desired. The other combo I found works well is EQ into P, 2x into P into E. This is the same thing as the previous combo. The only difference is instead of weaving in 1s before each E, we are weaving in 2s. I find that this combo works with the attack speed you get from Micah. You can also do this even without Micah, but from what I've tested, it will take a more fill time without the attack speed. So, this is the combo you'll want to do either if using a Micah, or if you need to perform a longer rotation, such as using Xing Shou on the team and your rotation needs to be 21 seconds anyway. Like the previous combo, you can weave in a in1 after the first E, before the Q, and after the very last E if desired. But now let's talk about his teams. Freminent is an on-field main DPS unit, and his kit heavily encourages him to use both Hydro and Electro. So, the core of his team is Freminent, Hydro, Electro, and a 4th flex slot. The 4th flex slot should ideally be either a buffer to enhance the team's damage, or a Dendro unit so that you're able to get Hyperblooms. So with this team structure in mind, here are the main teams I calculated and what I recommend. Team number 1, Freminent, Yelan, Faishal, and either Bennett, Zhongli, or C6 Micah. And team number 2, Freminent, Xing Shou or Yelan, Kuki, and Nahida. Let's go over the first team. Yelan is the Hydro of choice because she does good damage and provides a good buff. Faishal is the Electro of choice, because she does great damage, especially with the new Golden Troop set. And she only takes about 1 second of fill time, thus resulting in her not taking Bennett buff uptime away from Freminent, and also not making your rotations longer than needed. Then for the flex slot, Bennett results in the highest team DPS because his buff is huge, both for Freminent and Faishal. However, while Bennett performs the best on paper, this may not necessarily reflect in practice. This is because Freminent is a melee character, and Bennett restricts you to being within the field of his burst. Also, if you have Bennett at C6, you will lose a lot of damage due to your normal attacks now dealing pyro damage. Zhongli is the flex slot I recommend if you either don't want to deal with Bennett's circle impact issues, or if you have Bennett at C6. On paper, he is about 11% behind Bennett. However, the team DPS is still pretty good even with that loss. Plus, this gap can hypothetically be made smaller if you have a highly invested Yelan, since Zhongli increases her damage as well, but Bennett does not. Zhongli's shield can also be very nice for Freminent. Freminent does get an interruption resistance buff during his burst, but there are still attacks that can interrupt him. And then for Micah, I advise him the least because even with Micah at C6, he's only slightly ahead of Zhongli here. Unlike Zhongli, Micah does not provide you with his shield to avoid getting interrupted. His value will also not scale with your Yelan and Faishal's investments like Zhongli. However, he still works for this slot because he needs to be at least C6 to be viable. He also does lower Freminent's energy requirements, which can be pretty nice, especially if Freminent is not at C2 yet. Also, I included the DPS for using Xing Shou as your Hydra with Bennett as the 4th slot, just to see how he does as an alternative to Yelan. As we can see, he is behind by about 12%, but he can work as an alternative that will provide interruption resistance in exchange for all the lost DPS. But I would not recommend using him over Yelan unless you just don't have her available. But now let's talk about the Hyperbloom teams. Here, we replace Faishal with Kuki, because Kuki will act as our healer, and with Hyperbloom, her damage is higher than Fishal's as well. Having her consolidate the role of Electro and healer also allows us to use Nahida as our Dendro, which is absolutely what we want to do. So, that turns the team into Freminent, Xing Shou / Yelan, Kuki, and Nahida. As we can here, we can see that Yelan and Xing Shou are very comparable. With the Xing Shou, the Hyperbloom count on average seems to be about 16, while with Yelan, it came out to 11, which is what allows Xing Shou to be competent here. However, Yelan can scale far past Xing Shou with investment through things like her early constellations or giving her Elegy of the End. But if you don't have that investment on her, the two of them will be very close in terms of power for this team. So, which Freminent team do I recommend more? The Hyperbloom team has slightly more DPS than the Yelan Faishal Bennett team, but it also doesn't have any circle impact restrictions like the latter. But the difference is very small, so if you don't find the restrictions that come with using Bennett to be an issue, I say use whichever team you prefer. The Hyperbloom teams do, however, have access to much better vertical scaling thanks to Nahida's Constellation too. So overall, it is the team I would suggest the most for Freminent. And when it comes to Hyperbloom teams with an on-field DPS unit as the driver, a lot of people seem to look down on this. And this is understandable if the DPS is just slapped in without actually contributing anything to the team, but that's not really the case with Freminent. He isn't necessarily bringing anything unique to Hyperbloom, but you also aren't just slapping him in. His team structure already has both Electro and Hydro, so we don't actually have to take him out of his natural role to be used in Hyperbloom. It's just a matter of using Dendro as your 4th slot and replacing Fischl with Kuki. Freminent fits in here like a glove. He's also doing a significant portion of the team's damage here, and it's actually the highest portion of the team damage if Yelan is the Hydro. So I would not look at this team and think that he's just getting carried by Hyperbloom here. He's not going to be the best driver for Hyperbloom, but in my opinion, he is still really good there regardless. But with that said, as we can see, the highest DPS Freminent team I calculated came out to about 58k DPS. For context, I generally calculate with 4-star units at C6, 5 stars at C0, all units triple crowned, and the main damage dealer of the team on their best 5-star weapon. And if you aren't familiar with team DPS of teams calculated at the standards, 58k is extremely impressive for a 4-star on-field DPS unit team. And the DPS range that Freminent is around the range that I consider to be below average for a 5-star DPS. But again, Freminent is a 4-star, so this is extremely impressive. On-field 4-star DPS units are usually very far behind 5 stars, but because Freminent is a Claymore-wielding cryo-physical DPS, and with the title of this video, you are probably wondering how he compares to Eula, and in my calcs, I tend to get Eula around 55 to 56k DPS, so Freminent's team DPS actually calculates a tad bit higher than hers. However, I feel that it is important for me to add further context onto this. While yes, Freminent does perform this well on paper, that doesn't necessarily mean he is doing as good or better than Eula in practice. For example, Eula can perform a lot better in practice than she does on paper because spreadsheets calculate average damage. Eula's damage goes up massively if I change her burst from average damage to crit damage, going up by about 100,000. This takes her team DPS from 55k to 60k. Admittedly, this is still only slightly higher than what I have Freminent at, and you can also argue that this could make Eula perform worse in practice than she does on paper, since if she doesn't crit her burst, her damage will go down by about 300,000, resulting in the DPS going down from 55k all the way down to 43k. However, if you are using Eula with Rosaria, you should reasonably be able to get her to 70 crit rate at the least between Cryo Resonance and Rosaria's crit rate buff, so she should be getting a crit most of the time, but the massive drop-off if she doesn't is still there. It is much worse if you are using Micah instead of Rosaria. We also have to keep in mind that Freminent is a 4-star, and I already have him calculated at Constellation 6, so there is much less room for him to continue scaling his damage up compared to Eula. Pretty much the only option available, aside from getting constellations on characters like Nahida for him, is getting him higher quality artifacts. But Eula can also do the same thing, and her personal damage is a lot higher than his, so she will get more value from better artifacts than he will. And since she is a C0 5-star here, she still has room to get constellations compared to Freminent, already capped at C6. I should also mention that if Freminent is facing an enemy that can't be frozen for Shatter, his damage goes down by about 11%, taking his team DPS in the Bennett Facial team down to 53k, the Hyperbloom team down to 55k. But yeah, overall, Freminent's damage and his team output is very impressive for a 4-star DPS. It honestly surprised me to see how high it is. Now let's go over his constellations. Constellation 1 gives him an extra 15% crit rate to his elemental skill, results in about a 10% damage increase. C2 will make him gain 3 energy each time he does his max level skill, so a total of 9 energy in the combo that we are doing here. The damage increase from this does depend on his exact ER requirements in the specific team you are using, but for this calc it came out to be about a 5% increase over Constellation 1 and a 15% over C0. C3 increases his normal attack talent level by 3. This is about a 4% increase over C2, 19% over C0. C4 gives him 9% attack buff for triggering Frozen, Shatter, or Superconduct. This can stack up to 2 times for an extra 18% attack. This is a 4% damage increase over C3 and a 24% increase from C0. C5 increases his skill talent level by 3. This is a really nice because his skill is the highest portion of his damage, making up about 52% of his total damage in a rotation, so this ends up being an 8% increase over C4 and a 35% increase over C0. Lastly, C6 gives him 12% crit damage for triggering Frozen, Shadow, or Superconduct. They can stack up to 3 times for his 36% crit damage buff. This is his biggest constellation damage increase, being a 12% increase over C5 and a 51% over C0. So overall, Freminent has some pretty solid constellations, all of them giving him decent damage increases, but none of them change his gameplay at all. They literally just give him more damage, so he is still fully playable even at Constellation 0. He will just be doing about 51% less damage. If you are serious about using Freminent, I would advise trying to get as many constellations on him as you reasonably can, but do not feel forced to go deep for them right now if you don't want the 5 stars that he is with. Next, let's quickly go over Freminent's energy requirements. So, Freminent makes a surprisingly high amount of particles. His skill outside his burst makes 2, then inside his burst it makes 1. So in the combo that we are using here, he makes 7 particles. On top of this, as mentioned, his C2 will be giving him 9 flat energy. This sounds like it should make him not need to build any ER at all. It most certainly can, but Freminent is a burst-reliant character, so we really do want to make sure we hit his energy requirements. Exactly how much ER he needs will depend on the specific team. In the team of Freminent, Yelan, Faisal, Bennett, assuming Yelan is on Favonius, I would recommend going for about 128% ER. If you aren't using Yelan on Favonius, that goes up to 141%. However, if you aren't using Yelan on Favonius, you probably have her C1, otherwise I don't know how you're bursting on her. And if you do have a C1 Yelan that isn't on Favonius, 132% energy recharge for Freminent should be enough. If your Freminent is not C2 yet, you would want about 151 to 155% here. If Micah is your 4th slot, you shouldn't need any ER on Freminent at all. and about 112% if your Freminent isn't C2. Then with Zhongli, you almost certainly have him on Favonius, so with both him and Yelan on Favonius, Freminent should only need about 111% ER, 131% if Freminent isn't C2 yet. If you want to factor in for Zhongli possibly missing his pillar hits and not making any particles, you can add an extra 10 to 11% ER to Freminent. Keep in mind, however, that all of these numbers I gave for ER are accounting for low enemy particle scenarios. So a lot of times in practice, you may find that you need less energy recharge than this. Thus, I ultimately recommend playing around with your artifacts at different ER thresholds and seeing what works best for you. Okay, now let's talk about Freminent's artifacts. For his main stats, you want an attack sands, physical goblet, and a crit circlet. For the sands, if you don't have a C2 and you have to sacrifice too many crit and attack subsets to reach enough ER on him, then you may want to use an ER sands instead of attack. But aside from that, stick with attack sands. As for the artifact sets, his best set is going to be 4-piece Pale Flame. He fully stacks this on his first normal attack. Then for alternative sets, you can use 2 Pale Flame, 2 Bloodstained. It's only about 4% behind. For Gladiators is also an option, but it's much farther behind since it doesn't buff his skill, which is where most of his damage comes from. Lastly, let's go for his weapon options. His best weapon is going to be Beacon of the Reed Sea, with Skyward Pride, Redhorn, and Song of Broken Pines not far behind. An R5 Serpent Spine is also not far behind, assuming it's at 3 stacks on average. Behind that, you have Unforged, R1 Serpent Spine, and Wolf's Gravestone, all pretty similar to each other. The non-Battle Pass 4-star weapon options, the best ones are Snow-Tombed Star Silver and Prototype Archaic. Snow-Tombed is slightly better, but the difference is extremely small, so you can use whichever one you have. Tidal Shadow is also an option, only if you are using Micah or Kuki, since getting killed for its passive is unreliable otherwise. But even then, it is behind Prototype and Snow-Tombed, so I don't recommend it. And then, because Freminent's burst damage is only about 4% of his damage output, Luxurious Sea Lord is the lowest damage option out of all of these, and not recommended since craftable weapons are better than it. So to summarize, if you don't have a 5-star weapon for Freminent or you don't have Serpent Spine, go with Snow-Tombed or Prototype Archaic. And if you are serious about using Freminent, I'd recommend intending to eventually get a 5-star weapon like Beacon, Pride, Redhorn, or Broken Pines on him, since going from Snow-Tombed to Beacon, for example, is a gain of over 100,000 damage. But with that said, that covers everything I wanted to talk about with Freminent. Overall, I am very impressed with him and did not expect him to be so competent. If you are looking to get and invest into Freminent, he can absolutely be worth it, so by all means go for him if you want. I think between both him and Lynette, Fontaine is off to an excellent start with 4-star kits, and I hope they keep it up. But yeah, if you liked today's video, please be sure to press the like button and also leave a comment letting me know your thoughts. Thanks, bye.